Reggie Carter was a patient man. A middle school teacher in Lakeland, Florida, he spent his days creating lessons that made science come alive for his students, even when they were more interested in their phones than the periodic table. His life followed a simple rhythm: work, unwind, and enjoy his sanctuary at home. The modest brick house with a neatly trimmed lawn and a driveway just big enough for his car was his haven. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Or so he thought. That all changed when Blythe Vanderholt, his new neighbor, decided that Reggie's driveway was fair game for her luxury SUV. At first, Reggie thought it was a one-time mistake. Maybe she had guests over or was just moving things around. But when Blythe's silver Lexus kept showing up in his driveway, the small annoyance slowly turned into a battle of wills. He knocked on her door. She offered excuses. The car was just in the way for a few minutes, she said. No big deal, right? Wrong. Days turned into weeks, and Blythe's disregard for his property grew bolder. The more Reggie asked her to stop, the more dismissive she became. It wasn't until Blythe ignored him entirely and parked in his driveway with a second car that Reggie's patience was truly tested. And that's when the real story began. What would you do if you'd been patient for so long, only to be constantly ignored? Would you let it slide? Or would you finally take a stand? Reggie's decision changed everything, and what followed was a series of actions that would make Blythe regret ever crossing him. The quiet, patient man was about to become a force to be reckoned with, and Blythe had no idea what was coming next. Blythe Vanderholt had no respect for Reggie Carter's property. First, it seemed like a small thing. Her silver Lexus RX was parked in his driveway, just for a few minutes. Reggie let it slide, thinking it was an innocent mistake. But then it happened again, and again. Each time, Blythe had an excuse. She was just dropping something off, running inside for a second, or had a delivery that needed a little space. Her explanations were smooth, rehearsed, and delivered with that all-too-familiar tight-lipped smile, as if she expected Reggie to accept her words without question. But Reggie wasn't convinced. He noticed the little things. The dismissive wave of her hand, the fake surprise when she answered the door, and the condescending tone in her voice. He was trying to be patient, trying to be understanding, but this was his home, his space, and Blythe was violating it again and again. What was once an isolated incident was now becoming a pattern, one that Reggie couldn't ignore any longer. He came home one day, exhausted from a long day at school, only to find her Lexus parked dead center in his driveway again. No explanation, no note, just her car, blocking his path. Reggie's patience, which had been stretched thin, snapped. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the rising anger inside him. He knocked on her door, fully expecting the same rehearsed excuses. But this time, he couldn't shake the feeling that Blythe knew exactly what she was doing. When she answered, her expression was calm, almost smug. "Reggie, what's wrong?" she asked, the words dripping with fake innocence. She feigned surprise, as though it had never crossed her mind that parking in his driveway, time and time again, was wrong. When Reggie pointed out that her car was parked in his spot yet again, she responded with a laugh like it was no big deal. "I was just dropping something off, Reggie. You're overreacting," she said, her voice as sweet as syrup, but her words cutting like knives. Reggie was done being polite. He told her, calmly but firmly, that it had to stop. But Blythe, with that same dismissive smirk, didn't take him seriously. She rolled her eyes and made a half-hearted attempt to placate him, but nothing changed. The car stayed in his driveway. Days passed. Reggie's frustration grew. He left notes. He knocked on her door. Each time she had a new excuse, a new reason why it wasn't a big deal. But for Reggie, it was becoming a huge deal. His driveway was the one space he could call his own, the one place that gave him peace. Yet, every time he came home, there it was, Blythe's car, parked like it was hers, like his property didn't matter. Then came the night that tipped everything over the edge. Reggie returned home to find not just Blythe's Lexus, but another car, this one a sleek, black BMW, sitting in his driveway. Her car was blocking his garage, preventing him from getting inside. His family was coming over for dinner, And Blythe's blatant disregard for his property was not only disrespectful, it was ruining his plans. Reggie's patience, which had been stretched thin, finally snapped. This wasn't just about parking anymore. This was about power. Blythe thought she could get away with it, that she could continue treating him like he was invisible. He marched up to her door, ready for confrontation. When Blythe answered, the smile on her face was gone. But it wasn't fear. It was annoyance, as though Reggie was somehow inconveniencing her. "Whose car is that?" he demanded, pointing to the BMW in his driveway. Blythe answered without hesitation, "That's my friend's. We were having a little get-together." Reggie's heart raced. This wasn't a mistake. This was a deliberate act of disrespect. He was done asking politely. "Move it," he said through clenched teeth. Blythe, in her typical passive-aggressive manner, reluctantly agreed. But Reggie knew better. This wouldn't be the last time. And as Blythe closed the door, Reggie knew one thing for sure. She had crossed a line, and he wasn't going to stand for it anymore. Blythe's disregard for his property wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an insult. And Reggie was about to show her exactly what happens when you push someone too far. The calm, patient man was about to take matters into his own hands, and Blythe was in for a surprise she would never forget. Reggie Carter had always prided himself on being the calm one. As a middle school teacher, he spent his days managing classrooms of energetic kids, trying to make science engaging in a world that seemed more interested in screens than the periodic table. Patience was a virtue he'd honed over the years, and he applied it to everything, from teaching his students to handling life's everyday annoyances. But this was different. Blythe Vanderholt had pushed him to the edge. When he knocked on her door for the second time, asking her to move her car, he was furious. But he kept his voice steady. He had to. Blythe was always so dismissive, so wrapped up in her own world that she treated his requests like an afterthought. Reggie could feel the anger bubbling beneath the surface, but he swallowed it down. He knew the stakes. If he let her see how much this was bothering him, it would be like giving her power over him. He couldn't afford that. Her response was predictable. She smiled that tight-lipped smile, the one that said, "I'm in control here, and you're just overreacting." "It's not a big deal, Reggie. I'm just dropping something off. I'll move it in a second." The words rolled off her tongue with practiced ease, like they were meant to soothe him, to make him feel like he was the one being unreasonable. But they didn't work. Instead of shouting, instead of losing his temper like he wanted to, Reggie took a deep breath. His patience, tested to its limits, was still there. "I need you to stop parking in my driveway," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This is my property, and I've asked you nicely before. Please move the car." Blythe sighed dramatically, the way people do when they think they're being inconvenienced by someone else's perfectly reasonable request. "Reggie, it's just a few minutes. You live right next door. I don't see what the problem is," she said, dismissing him with a wave of her hand, like his concerns were just a nuisance to her busy life. Her tone was condescending, and the look in her eyes made it clear that she didn't see him as her equal. For a moment, Reggie thought about giving in, about just letting it go. It would be so easy to let her have this one. But then the realization hit him. If he let her disrespect his space, his property, now it would only get worse. This was a test, and Blythe was testing him every time she ignored his request. The anger that had started to build within him was still there, but he shoved it down. It was no longer about the car. It was about something bigger. This was about his right to be respected, his right to live in peace without someone violating his space. Blythe wasn't just parking her car in his driveway. She was showing him that she didn't think his boundaries mattered. "I've asked you before, Blythe," Reggie said quietly, his voice never wavering. "I need you to stop. I'm not asking anymore. I'm telling you, move it." Blythe didn't answer right away. Instead, she rolled her eyes, muttering something under her breath. But she did, eventually, move her car. The confrontation ended, but the uneasy silence that followed was worse than the argument itself. Reggie stood there, his heart racing, as Blythe disappeared into her house, the door clicking shut behind her. But Reggie knew something now. He had asked her to stop, and she had ignored him time and time again. The calm, patient man had tried to solve the problem peacefully, but Blythe had made it clear that she wouldn't listen unless there were consequences. And this time, Reggie wasn't going to let it slide. He wasn't going to back down. The next time she parked in his driveway, there would be no more calm requests, no more polite conversations. Blythe had crossed a line, and Reggie was about to make her regret ever thinking she could get away with it. His patience, stretched thin and tested to the breaking point, was Reggie Carter had been patient long enough. Every day, he had swallowed his frustration, hoping Blythe Vanderholt would get the message, hoping she'd realize that his driveway wasn't her personal parking space. But the more he gave her the benefit of the doubt, the bolder she became. The excuses, the dismissiveness, the disregard for his property. Reggie had tried to play it cool to keep his temper in check. But that night, as he drove down the street and saw her silver Lexus RX parked once again in the center of his driveway, something inside him snapped that he parked his car on the street, staring at the vehicle that had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the situation. It wasn't just a car anymore. It was Blythe's arrogance, her refusal to respect his boundaries, and it was blocking his garage, preventing him from getting inside. It was a slap in the face, a clear message that Blythe didn't care about the boundaries he had set, and that was something Reggie couldn't ignore any longer. His fingers clenched around the steering wheel. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, but it wasn't working. The rage built in him, slow and steady, like the rise of a storm. Blythe had pushed him too far. She had taken advantage of his kindness, his patience, for too long. And now Reggie was done asking. He wasn't going to plead. He wasn't going to knock on her door and beg her to respect his property anymore. He was going to take control of the situation in the only way left. He was going to make sure she learned a lesson she wouldn't forget. Reggie reached for his phone, his hand steady despite the growing fire inside him. He dialed the number for the local towing company, his voice calm, but with a note of finality that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in weeks. "I need a car towed," he said, his words clipped. "It's in my driveway, blocking my garage. It's a silver Lexus RX." The dispatcher on the other end of the line was polite, almost too polite, as if this was an everyday request. "Can I have your address, sir?" Reggie rattled off the details. He knew exactly what was coming. In less than 20 minutes, the tow truck would arrive, and Blythe's car would be gone. It felt almost surreal, like he had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. But it wasn't about the car anymore. It was about respect. It was about setting boundaries and making sure they were respected, no matter who the person was. Reggie had tried the calm approach, tried asking nicely, but Blythe had refused to listen. Now it was his turn to make the rules. He waited on the street, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on her driveway. The minutes felt like hours. His heart raced with anticipation, but there was no turning back now. He wasn't going to back down. Blythe had made it clear she wasn't going to take him seriously unless there were consequences, and tonight, he was going to make sure there were consequences. The sound of a truck pulling up broke his focus, and Reggie's eyes locked onto the tow truck as it rolled into view. The driver, a burly man with a no-nonsense expression, stepped out of the truck and approached Reggie. "You the one who called?" the driver asked. Reggie nodded, his gaze steady. "That's the car. It's mine now, and it's blocking my driveway. I need it gone." The driver looked at the Lexus, then at Reggie, then back at the car. "Got proof of ownership?" Reggie pulled out his property deed without hesitation, holding it up for the driver to see. The tow truck driver didn't bat an eye. He simply nodded, already moving toward the Lexus. "All right," he said, "let's get this done." The tow truck's arm swung into place, and in less than a minute, the Lexus was hoisted off the ground, its wheels locked in place. Reggie stood there, arms crossed, watching as the truck began pulling away. The sound of the engine, the squeal of the wheels, filled the air, and for the first time in weeks, Reggie felt a sense of relief wash over him. It was over. Blythe had crossed a line, and now she was going to feel the consequences of her actions. Reggie stood still, waiting for the inevitable. He didn't know how she would react, but he knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to take this lying down. The storm was coming. and Blythe had no idea what was about to hit her. Reggie barely had time to catch his breath before the inevitable happened. The tow truck had just disappeared down the street, Blythe's Lexus disappearing along with it, when he heard it. A series of sharp, furious knocks on his front door. The sound was like a fist pounding against his nerves. He didn't need to open the door to know who it was. Reggie stood up from his chair, taking his time to stretch, to breathe, to remind himself that this moment was a long time coming. He walked slowly to the door, his heart still pounding with adrenaline, but his demeanor calm, controlled. It was too late to back out now. He wasn't going to let Blythe walk all over him again. Not anymore. He opened the door, and there she was, Blythe Vanderholt, standing on his porch in a huff, barely able to contain her fury. She was wearing flip-flops and silk pajama pants, her hair slightly disheveled, a wine glass in her hand, like she was expecting to unwind for the night, not confront her neighbor. But tonight, Reggie wasn't the one who was going to be caught off guard. Her eyes blazed with rage, and she didn't even greet him. "Where's my car?" she snapped, voice sharp, laced with disbelief. Reggie stood there, calm and steady, as if nothing had happened. "You mean the one that was illegally parked in my driveway?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying all the weight of his frustration and resolve. Blythe's nostrils flared, her face turning a shade of red that suggested she was on the verge of exploding. "Don't play games with me, Reggie," she hissed, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. "Where is my car?" Reggie shrugged casually, his face the picture of indifference. "Towed," he said simply, as if the whole situation was nothing more than an inconvenience. "You wouldn't move it, so I had it removed." Blythe blinked, mouth falling open in shock. It was as though the world had tilted on its axis for a brief moment, and she couldn't quite catch up. "You did what?" she asked, her voice rising an octave, then another, until she was practically shouting. You can't just have my car towed." "Oh, I can," Reggie said, his voice low, calm, and utterly certain. "And I did." Her anger spilled over. "You're going to regret this?" she snarled, as if her words could somehow reverse what had already happened. "Do you know who I am? I'm on the HOA board, Reggie. I have connections. You think you can do this to me and get away with it?" Reggie didn't flinch. His eyes locked onto hers, unwavering. He wasn't scared. Not anymore. "Good for you," he said, the faintest hint of amusement creeping into his voice. "Your car's at Sunshine towing off Orange Blossom Trail. Have a good night." He started to shut the door. Blythe wasn't finished, though. She stood there for a moment, speechless, staring at the door as though willing it to open again. Then, with a shriek that was more of a wail than a shout, she slammed her fist against the door, causing Reggie to wince. Though he quickly regained his composure, she stood there, seething, before turning on her heel and storming down the porch steps. But her fury didn't end there. The next few minutes were like something out of a bad movie. Blythe called the police, furious and hysterical, demanding that Reggie be arrested for some perceived injustice, for the crime of protecting his own property. When the officers arrived, they barely gave her the time of day. After a brief exchange, the officer turned to Blythe, handed her a pamphlet for towing regulations, and said flatly, "Ma'am, he's within his rights. If you want your car back, you'll need to pay the impound fee." Blythe stood frozen, mouth agape. The world she had carefully constructed, her sense of control, her power, her influence, had begun to crumble, and it was happening faster than she could process. Reggie, standing back in his doorway, watched as her face turned crimson, the color of someone who had just realized they were no longer in charge. For a moment, he almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But this was Blythe Vanderholt, the same woman who had used her HOA connections to bully neighbors, the same woman who thought her entitled behavior could go unchallenged. And now, her facade was falling apart as the officer left and Blythe's car was towed away. Reggie leaned against the door, a calm satisfaction flooding his chest. But he knew this was far from over. Blythe wouldn't go down without a fight. Her ego, bruised and battered, would retaliate, and Reggie wasn't sure how far she'd go to get back at him. But one thing was certain. this was just the beginning. Blythe had pushed him, and now she would have to deal with the consequences. And in the end, it wasn't going to be Reggie who regretted any of this. Blythe Vanderholt wasn't the type of woman who took defeat lying down, and her ego, bruised by the towing incident, would not let her bow out gracefully. Reggie had known she wouldn't just let it go, but what came next was beyond what he expected. The very next day, after her car had been towed and she'd spent a fruitless hour ranting to the police, Blythe's passive-aggressive campaign began. And it wasn't just personal. She made sure the entire neighborhood knew she was the victim. The first sign came early in the morning when Reggie stepped outside to water his lawn, a ritual he enjoyed after a long day of teaching. As he crouched down to adjust the nozzle of the hose, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye, a piece of paper sticking out of his mailbox. He grabbed it, and as soon as his eyes scanned the words, he knew it was from Blythe. The note was written in bold, red marker, as if she was trying to make a statement. "This is a community. We should all be more considerate of our neighbors." It was short, simple, and yet dripping with the kind of judgment that made Reggie's blood boil. It was as if she had written the note just for him, as if it was her way of telling him he was the one out of line, that he was the problem. He could almost hear her condescending tone in the words. He crumpled the paper and tossed it into the trash without a second thought, but the anger it stirred in him lingered. The next few days were a series of increasingly petty moves. Reggie returned home from work one evening to find a letter waiting in his mailbox from the HOA. At first, he thought it might be a routine update, but as he opened it, his jaw tightened. It was a formal complaint, listing several violations he hadn't even known existed. Apparently, his front porch plants, which he'd had for years, were now in violation of the community aesthetic standards. And it didn't stop there. His trash cans had been left out too long, and the paint on his mailbox was fading. The audacity of it all was staggering. Reggie knew exactly who had filed the complaints. Blythe. She had found a way to use the HOA to carry out her vendetta. And this time, it wasn't just about parking, it was personal. He could feel the weight of her passive-aggressive tactics settling over him like a storm cloud that refused to dissipate. Every complaint, every letter, was a jab at his integrity, a reminder that Blythe was still fighting a war he didn't want to be part of. Then, as if that wasn't enough, Blythe began calling security on him. One evening, as Reggie was watering his lawn, a white security SUV pulled up in front of his house. A middle-aged officer, adjusting his belt like he had something important to do, stepped out and approached him. "You live here, sir?" the officer asked, his tone almost too formal, as though he was about to investigate a serious crime. Reggie frowned, confused. "Yeah, why?" The officer cleared his throat. "We received a call about some suspicious activity." Reggie's eyes flicked over to Blythe's house. Sure enough, there she was, standing on her porch with her arms crossed, staring directly at him. She was pretending to be oblivious, as if she had no idea what was going on. Suspicious. Reggie repeated, the word like a bitter pill on his tongue. "I'm watering my lawn." The officer, clearly uncomfortable, shifted his stance. "I'm just doing my job, sir," he said. "Please make sure everything is in compliance." Reggie fought to keep his temper in check. He could see Blythe smirking out of the corner of his eye, enjoying every minute of his discomfort. She wanted him to snap, wanted to provoke him into doing something she could use against him. But Reggie wouldn't give her that satisfaction. "I know who called," he said, his voice low, controlled. "Tell her to find a new hobby." The officer sighed, nodded, and walked back to his car. As he drove off, Reggie turned back toward Blythe, but instead of confronting her, he took a deep breath and focused on the task at hand, the lawn. Blythe, however, was not done. Every time Reggie stepped outside, it felt like she was watching, waiting for him to slip. He couldn't escape it. The tension in the air, the way she hovered just on the edge of his life, using the HOA to make his days a little more difficult. Reggie knew this wasn't the end. She wasn't just trying to ruin his peace. She was trying to make him crumble under the pressure. But what Blythe didn't know was that her strategy had the opposite effect. Each petty action she took only steeled his resolve. Reggie wasn't going to back down. It was a war now. And Blythe was about to realize she'd made the wrong enemy. Reggie had always prided himself on his ability to stay calm, to weather the storm, and to take the high road. But after weeks of Blythe's relentless passive-aggressive attacks, each one more calculated and petty than the last, something inside him snapped. He'd been patient, hopeful that eventually she would back down. But she didn't. Each new complaint, each new trick, was a reminder that Blythe saw herself as untouchable. And now, she had crossed a line that Reggie couldn't ignore any longer. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon when it happened. Reggie had just returned home from the grocery store, his arms full of bags. As he turned the corner onto his street, his heart sank. There it was, Blythe's silver Lexus RX, parked smack in the center of his driveway again. This time, it wasn't just blocking his garage. It was a slap in the face. It was as if she was daring him to do something, daring him to react. Reggie stood there for a moment, the bags still heavy in his hands. His eyes burned with frustration, his chest tight with a mix of anger and disbelief. He had asked her repeatedly to stop. He had warned her that his patience was running thin. And yet, here she was, parking her car in his driveway like she owned the place. For a long moment, he just stood there, staring at the car, feeling the blood rush to his face. His thoughts were racing. How had it come to this? How had this woman gotten under his skin so thoroughly? Reggie had spent years working with kids. Kids who were sometimes cruel, often difficult, but who had never driven him to this point. Blythe, with her arrogance and entitlement, had managed to turn his peaceful home into a battleground. He put the bags down on the sidewalk and took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. His first instinct was to go over there, knock on her door, and scream at her to get out of his life. But that wasn't who he was. He wasn't going to stoop to her level. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. But as the minutes passed, and Blythe's car sat there mocking him, something shifted. His patience, which had been stretched to the breaking point, finally snapped. He wasn't going to let her ruin his peace anymore. He wasn't going to back down. Not this time. Reggie reached for his phone, dialed the number for the towing company, and when the dispatcher picked up, he said, "I need a car towed. It's parked in my driveway again. A silver Lexus RX." The dispatcher asked for the details, and Reggie provided them without hesitation. His voice steady, calm, but with a cold edge that matched the fury brewing inside him. He wasn't asking anymore. He was taking control. Blythe had crossed the line one too many times, and now she would face the consequences. Less than 20 minutes later, the tow truck arrived. Reggie watched from his porch as the driver hopped out, assessed the situation, and went to work. He didn't feel any satisfaction in the moment. Instead, a heavy weight hung in the air, like the calm before a storm. This wasn't a victory. It was a necessity. As the Lexus was lifted off the ground and slowly pulled away, Reggie's stomach twisted with nerves. He knew what was coming. He knew Blythe would be furious. He had no idea how she would react. But one thing was for sure, this time it wouldn't be the same as before. She wouldn't be able to spin this in her favor. It wasn't just about the car anymore. It was about his right to live in peace. It was about setting boundaries and making sure they were respected. Reggie wasn't going to let Blythe win. Sure enough, less than an hour later, there was a loud knock on his door. Reggie didn't move. He didn't rush. He took his time, standing up slowly, adjusting his clothes, his mind already preparing for the confrontation that was coming. When he opened the door, there she was, Blythe, seething with rage. Her eyes were wild, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Where's my car?" she demanded, her voice sharp, as if she couldn't believe what had just happened. Reggie didn't say a word. He just stood there, watching her, waiting for her to catch her breath. He wasn't angry anymore. No, now he was calm, collected, prepared to deal with whatever she threw at him. Blythe, on the other hand, was shaking with fury. "You had my car towed?" she shouted, her voice cracking with the weight of her own disbelief. "You think you can just do that? I have connections, Reggie. I will." Reggie interrupted her with a single sentence, his voice cutting through her rant like a knife. "You've crossed the line, Blythe, and now you'll have to deal with the consequences." And just like that, the storm that had been building for weeks finally erupted. Reggie knew there was no going back now. He had taken a stand, and Blythe would have to face the consequences of her actions. The battle was just beginning. Blythe Vanderholt had never anticipated the fallout from her actions. She had always prided herself on controlling the neighborhood, using her position on the HOA board to bend people to her will, to shape the community in her image. But now, as the dust settled from the towing incident, something unexpected was happening. People were starting to turn against her. The walls she had carefully built around her power, her influence, were beginning to crack. At first, it was subtle. Reggie had done what Blythe had never expected him to do. He had fought back. And not only had he fought back, but he had won. Blythe's silver Lexus was towed, and the community had seen it happen. They had seen her smug arrogance turn into anger, her sense of entitlement exposed for what it truly was. She had crossed a line, and Reggie had made sure everyone knew it. The first signs of rebellion came through the whispers. At the grocery store, Reggie overheard one neighbor, a woman who had lived next door to Blythe for years, talking to a friend. "Can you believe what she did? Parking in his driveway like that, and then getting all upset when he had her towed? I always knew she was trouble. It wasn't just one person." The whispers spread like wildfire, a quiet but powerful wave of discontent. Blythe's reputation, built on years of manipulation and control, was unraveling. People who had once feared her or silently tolerated her were now speaking up. They were tired of living under her thumb. The complaints she had made against Reggie, the HOA violations, the ridiculous fines, started to look like nothing more than petty retaliation, and people were starting to take notice. One evening, as Reggie returned home from work, he saw it. A small group of neighbors gathered in front of his house, talking in hushed tones, exchanging looks that spoke volumes. It was clear that they weren't just discussing the weather. Blythe's name was mentioned in every conversation. Her tactics were no longer working. Later that week, Reggie received a message from another neighbor, this one a middle-aged man named Greg, who had lived in the neighborhood for over a decade. "Hey, Reggie, just wanted you to know we've got your back. We've seen what she's been doing to you. If she parks in your driveway again, you let us know. We'll deal with it." Reggie couldn't believe it. The whole neighborhood, once under Blythe's spell, was now standing with him. It was a humbling moment. He had never expected the support, but it felt like a powerful shift. He wasn't alone anymore. The community was waking up. But Blythe wasn't finished yet. She wasn't going to let go of her influence so easily. She doubled down on her efforts to ruin Reggie's reputation. Flyers started appearing around the neighborhood, crudely printed, laminated, and posted on mailboxes. The message was clear. Is this the kind of neighbor we want? A man who tows our cars without warning? This isn't how a community should work. But this time, no one was buying it. People started coming forward, sharing their own experiences with Blythe. The neighbor who had been fined $200 for leaving a wind chime on her porch. The young couple who had been harassed over their lawn ornaments. The mother who had received a call from security because her son, a teenager, was wearing a hoodie on the sidewalk. It turned out that Blythe's passive-aggressive tactics had been going on for years. And now, everyone was finally seeing her for what she truly was. Reggie was no longer fighting this battle alone. The support from his neighbors was palpable. It wasn't just about the car anymore. It was about standing up to the bully who had controlled the neighborhood for far too long. The tipping point came during the next HOA meeting. Blythe, ever the survivor, tried to rally support for herself, but the room was different this time. The tension was palpable as Reggie walked in. His presence no longer met with the uncomfortable silence it once was. His neighbors were behind him, and Blythe felt the weight of their gaze. She stood at the front, her face red with frustration, trying to maintain her usual air of authority. But it was clear, the game had changed. The support she once commanded had evaporated. When the board members began reading the complaints against Blythe, misuse of HOA resources, retaliatory actions, and harassment of neighbors. It was like watching her life crumble before her eyes. No one spoke up for her. No one defended her. The same people who had once whispered in her ear now turned away, disillusioned by her behavior. Reggie watched as Blythe's facade cracked, her power slipping from her fingers. She had underestimated the strength of a community united. And now, as the board voted to remove her from the HOA, Reggie felt a sense of quiet triumph. The neighborhood wasn't just reclaiming its peace. It was reclaiming its dignity as the meeting ended. Reggie walked out of the room, the weight of the moment settling into his chest. Blythe's reign of terror was over. It wasn't just his victory. It was the victory of everyone who had been pushed around, belittled, or ignored. And for the first time in a long while, Reggie felt a true sense of peace. The neighborhood had turned against Blythe, and there was no going back. The balance had shifted, and Blythe was no longer in control. The meeting had been scheduled for weeks, but as the date drew nearer, the tension surrounding it grew thicker, almost tangible. Blythe had been a fixture of the HOA board for years, holding the reins of power like a queen presiding over her kingdom. But that kingdom was crumbling, and the once untouchable woman was now facing the consequences of her actions. Reggie Carter had fought back, and now the neighborhood was rallying against her. The day of the meeting, Reggie could feel the weight of what was at stake. He wasn't just sitting in a room waiting for a vote. He was witnessing the dismantling of someone's carefully crafted empire. An empire built on manipulation, entitlement, and fear. He had made his stand, and now the community he'd fought for was ready to speak out. The room was packed, far fuller than any HOA meeting had ever been. Neighbors who had once avoided conflict or turned a blind eye to Blythe's power were now taking their seats, ready to bear witness. People who had been silenced for years were now finding their voices, and it was clear. This was not just another routine meeting. It was a reckoning. Blythe sat at the front, her posture rigid, eyes narrowed, scanning the room for support. The bravado she once wore like armor was now chipped, cracked, and fading. She had always been the one in control until now. The seat of power that she had once held with such certainty was slipping out from under her, and she could feel it. The whispers that had once been behind her back were now loud and clear. Neighbors who had feared her were no longer afraid to speak up. As the meeting began, the board members wasted no time. The chairperson, a middle-aged man with glasses, cleared his throat and opened the meeting with the usual formalities. But the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Reggie could feel the tension in his chest, but he was determined to stay calm. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was a fight for the entire neighborhood, a fight for justice. "Let's address the first item on the agenda," the chairperson said, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of solemnity. "We've received multiple complaints regarding the conduct of one of our board members, Blythe Vanderholt." Blythe's jaw clenched, her eyes flashing with indignation. She wasn't used to being called out like this. She wasn't used to being challenged. But there was no escaping it now. The chairperson continued, "We have gathered evidence of misuse of HOA resources, retaliatory actions against neighbors, and a pattern of harassment that has gone on for far too long. These complaints were investigated, and it's become clear that these actions were not in the best interest of our community." Blythe stood up abruptly, her face a mask of anger and disbelief. "This is ridiculous. I have done nothing but protect this neighborhood," she shouted, her voice trembling with fury. "I've worked harder for this community than anyone here, and now you're going to throw me out." Her words fell on deaf ears. The room was silent, save for the rustle of papers and the occasional cough. The board members were unmoved, their faces set in grim determination. No one was backing her up this time. Reggie stood up, his heart pounding in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. "You've bullied people, Blythe. You've used your position to make their lives miserable. You've terrorized this neighborhood for far too long. And I'm not the only one who's had enough." He looked around the room. One by one, other neighbors stood, their voices rising in solidarity. They spoke of the fines for trivial matters, the calls to security for petty reasons, the relentless complaints against anyone who didn't conform to Blythe's version of order. One woman, a mother of 3, spoke tearfully of how her family had been harassed for having a swing set in their yard. Another man, a widower, shared how Blythe had fined him for not trimming his trees quickly enough after his wife's funeral. Blythe's face went pale. She had always held the upper hand, had always been the one to dictate the rules, to enforce her will. But now, she was drowning in the truth, and the weight of it was crushing her. The chairperson cleared his throat again, his voice steady. After reviewing the evidence and listening to the testimonies of our neighbors, it is clear that Blythe Vanderholt's actions are a violation of our community's values. It is with great regret that we must remove her from the HOA board, effective immediately. Reggie felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was more than that. It was the sense of justice, of the community finally standing together to reclaim its peace. He had fought for this moment. The weight of Blythe's tyranny had been lifted. Blythe stood there for a moment, her face contorted with rage and disbelief. But there was nothing she could do. Her reign had ended, and the board's decision was final as the room erupted in quiet murmurs of approval. Reggie couldn't help but feel a surge of triumph. Blythe had tried to break him, but she had failed. And in the end, it wasn't just Reggie who had won. The whole neighborhood had thought Blythe's defeat was complete, but the ripples of it would echo through the community for years to come. She had underestimated the power of people who were no longer afraid to stand up for what was right. Reggie had led them to this moment, and now, with Blythe removed from the board, the neighborhood was free to heal, to rebuild, and to reclaim the peace that had been stolen from them. For the first time in a long while, Reggie could finally breathe easy. The battle was over, and he had won. The end came quietly, almost anticlimactically. After months of tension, petty battles, and endless confrontation, Blythe Vanderholt was finally leaving. She had fought tooth and nail to maintain her position of power in the neighborhood, using every trick in the book to try to push Reggie out of the way. But in the end, her control had slipped away, and with it, her sense of superiority. The power she once wielded had crumbled to dust, and the very community she had spent years trying to dominate was now rallying together. No longer afraid of her, no longer willing to let her dictate their lives. Reggie had known this moment would come, but that didn't make it any easier to watch. Blythe, standing on her porch as moving trucks pulled away, looked different somehow. Her posture was slumped, her eyes narrowed, but there was something else there. A flicker of realization. The people she had spent so long trying to control had finally stood up for themselves. And now she was leaving. The facade of power had cracked, and Blythe was walking away from the wreckage of her own making. It wasn't about Reggie winning. It was about everyone who had stood by, quietly enduring her tyranny, now seeing that change was possible. Blythe's defeat wasn't just a personal victory for him. It was a victory for the entire community. It was proof that standing up to the bullies, no matter how powerful they seemed, could result in real, lasting change. As the last of the boxes were loaded into the moving van, Reggie stood in his driveway, his arms folded across his chest, watching the scene unfold. It wasn't a moment of triumph, exactly. There was no feeling of gloating. Instead, there was a quiet satisfaction. The neighborhood was finally at peace. He had fought for that peace, and now it was his. But Reggie also knew that this moment held a deeper lesson. Blythe had spent so long assuming that her position of power was unshakable, that she could control everyone around her with her influence and her demands. But power built on manipulation, fear, and control is fragile. It's built on an unstable foundation that, when tested, will eventually crumble. Blythe's story was a reminder that power should never be used to dominate others. True leadership isn't about controlling people or using threats to get what you want. It's about fostering respect, trust, and community. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, and helping others do the same. And perhaps, most importantly, it's about understanding that real power comes not from forcing others to bend to your will, but from inspiring them to work with you, side by side, toward a common goal. As Blythe's moving truck pulled away, Reggie couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for the lessons learned through the struggle. He had learned patience, persistence, and the importance of standing firm in his beliefs. He had also learned that sometimes the best way to handle conflict isn't through confrontation, but through action. Blythe had been allowed to dig her own grave with her actions. And in the end, she had been the one to leave on her own terms, but with nowhere to go but out. But even in the midst of her defeat, there was a lesson for everyone watching. Change doesn't happen overnight. Sometimes it takes a long, hard fight. But when people come together, when they refuse to back down in the face of injustice, the result can be nothing short of transformative. For Reggie, this was more than just winning a personal battle against an overbearing neighbor. It was a moment of community triumph, a demonstration of the power of standing up for what's right. And as he stood there watching the last remnants of Blythe's influence disappear down the road, he felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. The neighborhood was his home again, and he had fought for Ayat Blythe's car disappeared around the corner. Reggie turned to his neighbors, who were gathered outside, offering support and congratulations. For the first time in a long while, everyone felt like they belonged. The sense of community that had been shattered by Blythe's actions was now stronger than ever. And as Reggie took in the peaceful neighborhood around him, he realized that this story wasn't just about his victory. It was about all of them, the people who had been afraid, the ones who had stayed silent, the ones who had finally found their voices. Together, they had turned the tide, and together, they had made a difference. If you've enjoyed the story and the lessons it holds, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It's a reminder that change is possible, no matter the odds. Stay tuned for more stories of resilience, community, and standing up for what's right. Your support means everything. Together, we can make a difference.